You're very welcome back to another edition of Low Blow Shorts. I'm Jer Leggett, and today I'm looking to discuss AEW, aka Tony Khan's expensive excuse to hug his favorite wrestlers. Specifically, I want to address the steady but notable decline in interest in the company since it became the first company since WCW to become a legitimate contender for WWE. It was a period where anything seemed possible. CM Punk came back and got in more fights backstage than on screen because he kept getting injured. MJF said fuck Tony Khan on the telly. Chris Jericho's skin grew gradually more pink each week. They filled Wembley. Women randomly beat the piss out of each other to a bloody pulp for very trivial reasons. None of us really understood, but it was cool. Then they made Roderick Strong into a comedy act, and it all seemed to disappear in front of our eyes. Adam! The joke is he said his name loudly. And look, I'm not saying that things here are terminal. This isn't WCW when they made Doofy from Scream their world champion. This isn't ECW when Paul Heyman's checks bounce quicker than my hinge dates when they realize I do not look like my profile picture. This isn't even TNA during that period under Dixie Carter when it seemed like they changed names or lost TV deals on a weekly basis. My personal favorite was when they said if you subscribe to their app, then they'd have a King of the Mountain match in your back garden. But still, it's not like it once was, is it? Aggressive AEW diehard fans who might already be filling the comment section with their virgin riz will push back on this and say stuff like, hey, AEW sold 50,000 tickets to Wembley just the other week. But come on, even that, which seems to be an ever so slightly gimmick number, not that there's anything wrong with that, is around a 35 to 40% dip year on year. And as a result, AEW have moved their annual UK pay-per-view in 2025 to an as yet undisclosed London location and pivoted all into Texas instead. And I'm not going to get into conversations about the demo here because seriously, who has the time? But when you compare ratings year on year, the situation gets even bleaker. Last week, PW Torch reported that ratings for Dynamite's All Out Go Home show were down nearly 200,000 viewers since last year, numbers that bear out over a 10-week average. As you can see from the graphic, AEW Dynamite has lost over 30% of their viewership over a 2-year period. That's not good by any standards. Even locally, last weekend at Low Blows, we took advantage of the Woolshed getting a Saturday late license for Brazilian Independence Day to test the waters of interest in AEW with a mini party in Ned's Bar for AEW All Out. And compared to our attendance for the WrestleMania and SummerSlam parties we ran earlier in the year, it fell off a cliff. At one point, we had as few as 13 people in attendance, while an 8-match pay-per-view ran for 15 hours. And I had to mouth, I'm so sorry, to the absolutely heroic Woolshed bar staff who worked super late, making very little in return for it. Meanwhile, after months of renegotiations and WWE announcing game-changing new TV deals with the likes of Netflix, despite Tony Khan's reassurances, there doesn't seem to be any sign of a new TV deal with Warner Brothers Discovery, who were reported to also be looking at WWE before they reach new deals. Since we couldn't risk the copyright of it all, here's a reenactment of Tony Khan answering questions about said new TV deal at various press junkets over the last week. Tony, is there any new agreement with WBD reached last week? Oh, wow, these microphones are big. I went to Paris with the executives. It was lovely. Paris is a glorious city. So there's no new deal. Warner Brothers Discovery is a beautiful company that I will raise future generations of my family to love. The Sopranos reinvented television as we know it. To reiterate, you haven't signed a new television deal yet. You know, the word new comes from the Old English new and the Latin novus. It has a long and complex lineage that I wouldn't feel comfortable disparaging. So who can say what is defined as new anyway? Certainly not I. Yes or no, Tony? Have you signed a new contract to continue showing AEW on TBS and TNT for future years? No, not yet. No, we haven't. The mad thing is, there's not that much difference between AEW now and the company at its peak a few years ago. CM Punk and Cody Rhodes have jumped ship to WWE, but in their place are arguably equally big and exciting names like Mercedes Moné, Adam Copeland, Will Ospreay, and Kazuchika Okada. This is by no means intended to be a hit piece on the company, but a genuinely intrigued look into what is causing this to a company who are easy to make fun of at times, but in truth, whose product I actually really enjoy and would like to see succeed. Again, to be clear, I don't think AEW is dying by any means. There's still a lot of general interest in the product, both in the US and abroad, but in fans' eyes, it just seems to have stopped becoming must-see TV. When I look at All Out, for example, and why people didn't come out for it where they were happy to for the likes of WrestleMania and SummerSlam at Low Blows parties, I think people are still probably vaguely interested in AEW and keeping one eye on it. Some may watch the pay-per-views the next day. Some might just catch the highlights on YouTube or social media. Most will just keep an eye out for the big cards or matches and stick to them. I don't think the story here is that AEW doesn't have fans anymore, but I don't think their fans are as willing to go out, to stay up late, to spend money, and give up a Saturday night on the product in the same way WWE fans probably currently are. It's not dying, but it's also not a stretch to ask, is it disposable? So if that's the case, then let's look at why that may be. And before we begin, here are a list of things I'm absolutely not calling into question. One, the talent. There's an argument to be made that the current WWE and AEW rosters are 1A and 1B in whatever order you prefer for being the most talented pro wrestling rosters assembled of all time. With AEW, the roster is so stacked, it becomes almost a problem. Like, how do you keep Okada out of the title picture? Hangman Page just main evented their latest pay-per-view after arguably having the quietest year of his AEW career to date. And nobody even seems to have noticed that there's no word on Adam Cole's return yet because there's just so many other people in the mix. Two, the match quality. With talent of that caliber, it obviously follows that the quality of wrestling is sky high too, to the point that it almost becomes a blur at times. Like, take Friday night, the Elite and the Blackpool Combat Club had an 8-man tag team match to main event AEW Collision that was fucking sensational and has gotten very little buzz just because that's the world we're living in now and we're all just used to it. Three, the buy-in of everyone involved. On Saturday alone, Adam Page put a syringe into Swerve Strickland's mouth and whacked it with a chair. MJF took a top rope pile driver from Daniel Garcia. Pac and Will Ospreay wrestled as if they had just evolved beyond having necks. Whatever is going on with AEW, it's not because the talent don't give a shit, because they clearly very much do and consistently put everything they have on the line in the ring. So now, when we've spoken about what the problem isn't, let's look at some of the reasons that AEW may be more disposable than the rest. One, more is less. Believe it or not, when we kicked off Low Blows in 2012, the done wrestling fan culture was for people to stay up and watch and live tweet Raw every Monday. Now, did we moan about having to do so? Like, that was the era of Raw being 3 hours and that being the bane of our lives? Yes, we did, but oh, how little we knew back then. Nowadays, if you want to be on the cutting edge of wrestling social media, and to be clear, I really recommend you don't be, or then you'll become Robert, and nobody needs that. Here's what the last couple of weeks would have involved you having to watch live. 3 hours for WWE Bash at Berlin on Saturday, 25th of August. You've got 2 hours more of Collision that night. You've got 3 hours of Raw on Monday. You've got 2 hours of Dynamite on Wednesday. Wrestling ran out of hours on Friday night. So SmackDown and Collision aired at the same time, which then led into Rampage, which then led into the countdown to All Out. And then, on top of all that, you had AEW All Out. And let's discuss AEW All Out. It was the second AEW pay-per-view in 3 weeks, so they mercifully decided to go easy on us by giving us only an 8-match card as opposed to their usual 17 matches. Of course, Tony Khan is going to Tony Khan, so on the day he added 3 more matches to the 0-hour pre-show, including must-see bouts like Dustin Rhodes, Sammy Guevara, and Hologram versus Tony Nese, Ari Daivari, and Josh Woods. What would we do if we hadn't seen that match the other night? But still, we had an 8-match main card, so surely this would be a chance to give us a nice, fun sprint of a 3-hour show that will leave us all begging for more, right? Nope. Not one single match on the card went less than 15 minutes. 4 out of the 8 matches went over 20 minutes and 2 went over 25 minutes. It got to the point that during the 4-way international championship match, when everyone just started doing non-stop vertical suplexes on each other, it felt like the show was just trolling us. Especially in a world where AEW are now doing 9 pay-per-views this calendar year, not every show needs to be 4 hours and end in the UK and Ireland at 5 a.m. Not every card needs to have over 10 matches, including 0 hour. And not every one of those matches needs to go long, have 15 near falls, and people kicking out of each other's finishers. It's the old Ring of Honor conundrum when that was at its peak. If every match on your card is an epic classic, none of the matches are, or it becomes at least incredibly difficult to have those standout matches and moments that set the world on fire and builds buzz around your product. It's not that you need to tell your talent to have shit matches on purpose so the good ones stand out, but you need to be disciplined in what you do and pick a lane. If you want your entire card to be filled with long epics, you kind of have to go the new WWE route and have shorter cards focusing on the must-see matches. If you want to have a stacked card with as many of your talent as possible booked, you've got to be disciplined and pick your spots and let the popcorn matches be fun but unremarkable 8 to 10 minute sprints to keep the crowd lively, but don't wear them out for the bigger moments. 2, the predictability of their shows. At Low Blows, from what I've seen at least, we run the only kind of pro wrestling fantasy football style league in our own annual pay-per-view prediction contest, which is now in its 12th year. This is really interesting because it allows us to actually quantify data on how predictable wrestling is based on who our participants picked to win matches ahead of time, weighed against variables that go into it, such as bookies odds and so on. We can then take that data and drag it out to tell a story about the predictability of wrestling, and it's not a particularly pretty picture for AEW. For reference, in 2024, this is how each of the 3 major pro wrestling promotions landed when it came to how predictable their cards were. Perhaps surprisingly to many, WWE are actually the least predictable of the bunch, with participants correctly picking around 30% of what happens on their big cards. New Japan come in slightly more predictable at 41%, but AEW are by far the most predictable of the big 3, with fans correctly guessing what's going to happen 52% of the time, a whopping 22% more than WWE. With AEW All Out specifically, in every single match, the person we'd picked as favourites based on the likes of booking odds won. And while this was good news for me, who plays the contest and got 100% of the outcomes right, so I got a lot of points, it does have a knock-on on engagement, or at least how essential your product feels. Because look at it this way. If you're Irish, for example, when you've already watched a shitload of wrestling throughout the week, or have an increasingly steep mountain of other content to catch up on, why would you stay up until 5 a.m. when you can pretty much guess the gist of what's going to happen, when you can watch in comfort the next day or catch up with the highlights on YouTube or social media? All of this has a kind of knock-on subliminal impact on fans that your product isn't must-see because they can guess what's going to happen, even if your wrestlers are breaking their backs to wrestle absolute classics as they are. 3, accessibility in Ireland. Now let's look at what the experience is like for fans who actually do want to follow along. This is the era of ease of access streaming TV. Watch what you want when you want. So it's crucial that if you want people to watch at a certain time, you make it really easy for your audience to be able to do so, or else there is literally hundreds of hours of alternative content competing for their attention. So the question becomes, do AEW make it easy? Well, let's go with my own experience as a reference. In Ireland, if you want to watch AEW's weekly show, you need to subscribe to Triller TV, and trust me, more on them in a second. That subscription costs $8.99 per month, and with that, you don't get access to the full Triller catalog, you just get AEW Plus, which gives you Dynamite, Collision, and Rampage each week. It doesn't include pay-per-views, which hit you for around an extra €23 a pop per month. Compare this to, say, Disney Plus, which is just €2 more expensive each week. But in addition to all the new content they put out weekly, gives you access to every Marvel or Star Wars movie and TV show ever and all the rest. Or let's compare like for like and compare it to WWE Network, which will cost you €4 more, but you will get every pay-per-view included in that price. Then there's the experience of watching Thriller TV itself, which ironically feels like listening to Thriller by Michael Jackson. It should be a simple, enjoyable experience, but it's so wrapped up in bullshit, you just end up screaming at your television a lot. I have about 4 bajillion devices in my home, but since Thriller is only available as an app on certain TVs and not on PlayStations, my only real way to watch Thriller TV conveniently on a screen bigger than a laptop is to use a Chromecast, which is a fucking nightmare. I've yet to watch a single live Thriller show on Chromecast which wasn't beset by lagging to the point that you just can't follow along on social media live because you absolutely will get spoiled. And then if you can't actually follow along with the conversation around the show, why watch live at all? It's a little bit more reliable watching it on demand, but even then, if you use any other apps on the phone you're casting off Thriller, we'll just forget that it's connected. So you either need to reconnect to skip through each ad break or just sit and watch the AEW Dynamite logo for 3 minutes at a time, 6 to 8 times per show. If you want to watch AEW on regular TV, well, that's not actually possible in my case. I'm a Sky Glass and Stream subscriber, which rules out watching ITV4, the network that airs Dynamite, on a 2-day delay, and Collision 4 days after it airs. As a customer, I don't feel like they're making it essential or even in some cases possible for me to follow the product up to the minute. And if I feel disposable, is it a prize if an otherwise solid product then begins to feel disposable to me too? 4. Tony Khan. Remember those beautiful early days of AEW where Cody, the Young Bucks, and Kenny Omega were going to be the faces of AEW, and Tony Khan assured us he absolutely wasn't going to be another on-screen authority figure in the vein of decades of WWE content. It feels like every week now we have to live with a Tony Khan announcement that will forever change the landscape of professional wrestling that turns out to be some bullshit and really underwhelming. Like AEW has a new podcast where Bryce Remsburg and Aubrey Plaza get into the psychology of the zebra stripes. Not only has Tony gone back on his promise of being an on-screen authority figure, he's at least mentioned multiple times now on almost every AEW broadcast, which, as discussed, there are fucking many. He's now overexposed and he's become a bit of a meme, if anything. And look, you can have your thoughts on him, and I have plenty. For me, my thoughts are he's corny. It's impossible to take him seriously as an on-screen exec because he looks and acts like a Make-A-Wish kid. Everyone is just indulging to play wrestling when he's on screen. He's infuriating and totally redundant as a public representative of the company, known more nowadays for filibustering and giving non-answers to direct questions in press conferences that he organizes, by the way. I could go on. But when you boil it down, regardless of what you think of him, whether you like him or not, while there would be no AEW without him, not a single fucking person on the planet who follows AEW watches every week because he's an on-screen persona. Take the NFL draft, for example, when Tony Khan showed up like a fucking lunatic wearing a neck brace, selling the injury that he suffered at the hands of Jack Perry in the Elite previously that week. You can see what he was going for. In his mind, he thought this is going to be such good exposure for AEW with everyone asking questions about this at a high-profile event like the NFL Draft, which is what you would think if you weren't aware that you were Tony Khan and the world would just think this is your silly little vanity project, and instead you just reminded those who liked wrestling about wrestling and they see what's up with the real stuff like WWE instead of your little plaything. And they say there's no such thing as bad exposure, but the people who said this had obviously never been exposed to Tony Khan. If the only exposure the world gets to you is Tony Khan being a silly Billy, it doesn't matter about the hours and hours of amazing wrestling that happen every week outside of this. That's going to be the impression they walk away with of the kind of presentation that you're offering. And that is just not fair on the talent. 5. It's begun to feel like a place wrestlers have to go, rather than they choose to go. There was like a year or so when AEW seemed like the hottest ticket in wrestling, and that every contracted WWE wrestler looked like Vince McMahon's hostage, smiling in sham videos while their eyes screamed, "Help me!" and making tweets talking about how cool it was they get to travel the world and feed their families. This was the company that made CM Punk fall back in love with wrestling. This was the company that Bryan Danielson left WWE for, even after they had a main event WrestleMania again and be the strongest challenger to Roman Reigns yet. They didn't sack half their staff during a pandemic. They didn't do cringy ideas like the Thunderdome. Even little things like Brody Lee's tribute show just felt more authentic and hit an emotional note that WWE had seemingly forgotten how to play. Not to mention that, as cringy as we've discussed Tony Khan being, he's almost definitely not a sex offender like the then WWE CEO was. Then, seemingly overnight, it all seemed to change. I remember debating all of this on the Low Blows podcast a couple of years ago, kind of at the height of AEW, if all the backstage drama was actually good for the company or not. On one hand, the argument went the scandal of it all generated huge engagement and discussion for the company that kept it on top of the wrestling world agenda. But I took a longer view, pointing out that it was a real working environment that wrestlers still had to live in day to day. And not only are you then, by associating yourself with that drama, associating your own personal brand with mess to the public, but it's going to have a knock-on effect for the company itself. Fast forward to AEW All Out 2023. Perhaps what we can see as the turning point for many from when AEW became this haven for great pro wrestling, where even the biggest stars secretly wanted to be. Cody Rhodes, the man who had started the company with Khan and was executive vice president, was several months off main eventing WrestleMania and very much en route towards doing so again, where he'd eventually defeat Roman Reigns and end his 4-year title reign. Khan opened that show by coming on stage and discussing that he had fired CM Punk due to fearing for his life at the latter's outburst at Jack Perry before All Out, an outburst he inexplicably decided to air months later, which called into question the low bar that causes Tony Khan to fear for his life. But fear not, because AEW had another huge replacement signing lined up that would fill the void left by CM Punk. They had the beloved Adam Copeland. Now, I want to be clear. That's not a dig at Copeland. He is a great wrestler, a surefire Hall of Famer, and he's even managed to be a highlight of stuff like Disney Plus's Percy Jackson series. So he's building a really high-profile name even outside of wrestling for himself. And as a standalone signing, he is a great guest by any stretch of the imagination. But he'd also just been on SmackDown a few weeks beforehand, with his WWE run coming to a kind of unceremonious end with a match against the one person you think of most when you think of Edge's WWE career. Sheamus. Yeah, that's who I think of anyway. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't doubt for a second that Copeland's claim that he could have signed a new WWE contract, but also it felt kind of like he'd run his course there and there wasn't a huge demand for him, at least from the fan side. It struck a bit of like an Impact Zone signing back in the day, you know, when WWE wrestlers had kind of hit a dead end, so they jumped to TNA, used the word professional wrestling like they were absolute madzers in promos, and then proceed to have perfectly fine but forgettable runs that would leave, frankly, nobody in Titan Towers losing a wink of sleep that night. That's kind of the vibe now. They've still made some amazing signings this year. Mercedes Moné, Kazuchika Okada, and Will Ospreay are all fantastic additions to the rosters. But once you've kind of got that stink on you and the biggest stars we all know that you'd love to keep, the likes of Cody Rhodes and CM Punk, or like Danielson was for WWE when he jumped to AEW, once they're choosing to jump ship the other way, the world begins to notice. And it's kind of come full circle to the point now that AEW's wrestlers are the one firing off defensive explainers for why they're there in the way that WWE guys used to. Copeland, for example, will tell anyone who'll listen that he's having the most fun he's ever had in his career, which, couple of things. One, really? Feuding with House of Black is really more fun than peak Edge and Christian, the Rated R superstar, main eventing WrestleMania. And two, even if that's the case, there's an old phrase in movie review circles that if it looks like the actors are having fun of a project, then the audience generally isn't. Again, I don't mean to come for Adam Copeland here. Of a lot of time, respect, and admiration for his work. And I'm not saying his work here has been poor here. It hasn't. It's just, you having fun doesn't necessarily equal us having as much fun. And the really difficult thing when you kind of weigh all of these factors up is that the spot AEW are in as being a kind of fun but ultimately disposable alternative to WWE is really, really tough to overturn. Like, if signing Ospreay, Monet, and Okada and re-signing MJF to a new contract doesn't do it, I'm not sure what else does. There's no instant quick fix here because it's not actually about quality. AEW All Out was, by any standards, an excellent wrestling show. It's about perception. It's about how the audience feels when they hear the letters AEW, and not just if they generally feel positive or negative about you. I'd say the majority of people who know AEW would be more positive than negative if you ask them. But are they willing to get off their arses and pay big money to come to your shows? Nearly 40% of people who went to Wembley just last year weren't. Are they willing to watch the vast amount of content that you put out and stay fully engaged? 30% have said they aren't over the last 2 years. Are they willing to stay up late and get a gang of their mates to go down to the Woolshed on a Saturday night to watch your show? Or will they just catch up tomorrow? The answer to these questions, unfortunately, keep coming back as not great. Maybe in 2024, it's time to accept that it's less AEW, as in all elite wrestling, and more ADW, which is all disposable wrestling. And it's sad to write them off considering how great the product can be at times and how hard everyone involved works to make it great. But it feels like they had their shot. And well, to quote the great Omar Little from The Wire.
Hey, yo, lesson here, babe. You come at the king, you best not miss.
I think the question we've got to ask here to kind of wrap this up is, did AEW have their shot and did they miss? I'm going to be back in a few weeks where I look at whatever the hell is going to come out of the Vince McMahon Netflix documentary series. Stay tuned for that. Subscribe on YouTube, ideally, or if you prefer the audio-only versions for some reason and don't like to see my amazing face, we also release them on the Page 180 Spotify. Until then, that's the bottom line, because Low Blow said so.